Our spring semester just commenced yesterday, so there is no better way than to commence our semester with an inaugural public lecture hosted by the Center for Postgraduate Legal Studies. So, on behalf of myself and the Vice Chancellor, we have great pleasure in welcoming everyone to join us this very important lecture to be delivered by Professor Philip J. McConaughey, excuse my pronunciation in case I'm getting it wrong. As you can read from his profile, he is currently the Vice Chancellor of Shenzhen Graduate School, Dean and Professor, School of Transnational Law, Peking University in China. And he has got a very interesting title for the talk this afternoon that reads China's Impact on the Western Legal Tradition, a preview from the Pearl River Delta. Now, it has two important connotations, Philip, if I may say, and this reminds me of a very famous work by William Twining, which reads General Jurisprudence and Globalization of Law from a Global Law Perspective, which happens to be a condensed version of his lectures delivered overseas, and William Twining is currently the Emeritus Professor at the University College London. To borrow from this particular phrase, this title somehow leads us to think of the implications of globalization on law as a discipline and legal education with a comparative perspective, which is very important for all the current day lawyers and law students to sort of take up successful careers in a globalizing world. And the other part is the Pearl River Delta story, which is so very interesting and fascinating, and Philip will tell more about that particular story. But on this particular note, if I may be allowed to just recall what Jeffrey Lehman has mentioned in his work on transnational legal education in the 21st century. For those of you who are not aware, Professor Jeffrey Lehman is a great friend of our university and a member of our board of advisors. So he says that, I quote, that the School of Transnational Law is a fairy tale story. It was a fairy tale story in terms of its vision, aspirations, and objectives. And the School of Transnational Law, Peking and Jindal were established or set up at the same time. So I am just going to just say that there are two fairy tale stories. One is from Shenzhen and the other one is from Sonipat, if I may say so. But for now, although we have a tale of two cities, but I would leave it to Philip to tell us more about their story and their academic engagement with students, which would be surely beneficial to each one of us present here, and particularly students. On this particular note, now I would request Professor Rajkumar to give his remarks.
I'll keep it short. Thank you so much, Sridhar. We are really privileged to be able to host Professor Philip McConaughey and his colleague Colin from the Peking School of Transnational Law. I mention this because we have this journey of institution building has been together. They were established a year before Jindal came into being. And for those of you who may not be aware, on 7th August 2009, when we had our Founders Day celebration, and this room was the only room that was available in the entire campus, I was giving a tour of the people who were there at the founding, and guess who was there? Jeff Lehman was there on 7th August 2009. He was at the inauguration, at the founding of the school, along with Lauren Robel, the then Dean of the Moral School of Law, Indiana University, David Wilkins, the then Vice Dean of the Harvard Law School, and many others. And so, in some ways, this journey has been quite inspiring for all of us, and we are very delighted that another distinguished institution builder, Professor McConaughey, who besides being currently the Dean, he was also Dean of the Penn State University School of Law, the founding Dean of that school, and so and vast experience of being a practitioner at leading law firms, including at Morrison & Foster, as well as being a distinguished scholar. So it's quite rare that universities are in a position to have individuals who have contributed so substantially towards the development of law as well as institutions together. And I believe that the Peking School of Transnational Law is very fortunate to have somebody like Professor Philip McConnaughay leading it right now. And we are spending time together to talk about how Jindal and STL can do things together, and we intend to learn from the extraordinary journey that they have undertaken, and we hope to build partnerships and collaborations that will bring together our students, our faculty. So once again, I would like to extend a warm welcome to Philip and Colleen to India and to Jindal, and I invite you to deliver your distinguished public lecture.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much, Vice Chancellor Kumar and Professor Sridhar, and to everyone at Jindal Global Law School for arranging my lecture, and thank you especially to all of you who are here this afternoon to attend. My topic concerns the likely impact on the Western legal tradition of China's growing global economic influence. And by Western legal tradition, just to clarify, I'm referring broadly to those bodies of law having their origins in Roman law or canon law, mainly the civil law tradition and the English common law tradition. These two traditions together are commonly regarded as the Western legal tradition. And the Western legal tradition clearly dominates worldwide commerce today. I'll be using commercial developments and legal developments in China's Pearl River Delta region to preview what I believe will be the eventual blending of Chinese and Western traditions and practices as China's worldwide influence grows. The Pearl and its tributaries empty into a delta that begins in the city of Guangzhou and then flows into Shenzhen Bay and the South China Sea surrounding Hong Kong. This small area of Guangdong province is the Pearl River Delta. Less than 40 years ago, the Pearl River Delta included largely farming and fishing communities devoted to agriculture. Today, it is an emerging mega-region whose combined population is expected to grow to more than 80 million people. The World Bank recognizes the Pearl River Delta as the world's most populous single metropolitan area. To illustrate, this is a photo of Shenzhen, where I live and where the School of Transnational Law is located in 1980. The next photo is the identical view today. And that's a radical transformation. Shenzhen was China's first special economic zone, designated that by Deng Xiaoping in 1978. Today, it is a metropolis of over 20 million people. It is known as China's Silicon Valley. It's home to such internet, energy, and biotech giants as Huawei, Tencent, the owner of WeChat, BYD, DJI Drones, Beijing Genomics Institute, and many others. For several years running, Shenzhen has had the highest annual municipal GDP rate in China, averaging close to 9% annually for a couple of decades. Shenzhen alone accounts for almost 50% of China's total annual international patent applications. Shenzhen also is Hong Kong's closest neighbor. We're just minutes to the north of Hong Kong. International investment in the Pearl River Delta is booming, with companies and entrepreneurs from around the world vying to participate in what seems to be the region's limitless economic potential. And China has deliberately engaged in substantial infrastructure development that is designed to connect all of the cities around the Pearl River Delta: Guangzhou, Shenzhen, Hong Kong, Macau, Zhuhai, and a few others. And this is the megacity of the future. One of the more remarkable aspects of all of this development, which has been very, very recent, especially from the perspective of lawyers and law professors and law students, is that it is occurring in the context of a legal infrastructure that is essentially in its infancy to the extent it even exists. Unlike Hong Kong, with its deeply embedded rule of law and common law traditions, reliable independent judiciary, mature regulatory institutions, and established legal profession, the Chinese, the mainland side of the region, is a mix of commercial and legal customs that are not uniform, imported civil law and Soviet codes, judicial and regulatory institutions that only recently have begun to modernize, and a small but growing legal profession that barely even existed in 1990. What the inevitable economic integration and internationalization of the region will mean for the legal institutions of the Pearl River Delta is unclear. On the one hand, there is consensus that legal infrastructure modernization and something approximating conventional Anglo-European notions of the rule of law is essential for sustainable economic development. The phrase ruling the country according to law has been a part of China's constitution since 1982, and many have interpreted this to signal an inevitable movement in China toward a Western-style rule of law. On the other hand, there is a consensus, as there must be, that the ultimate choice of legal regime will be China's, with attributes and characteristics that reflect uniquely Chinese legal and commercial practices and traditions. This fact has been emphasized in recent Communist Party pronouncements that reiterate party supremacy over law and require a selective rather than indiscriminate incorporation of Western legal concepts. Nonetheless, China clearly remains open to experimenting with laws and legal institutions that incorporate Western standards, as a joint communique just a few weeks ago, by the Ministries of Justice and Finance reflects. They are encouraging for the development of an economy increasingly shifting from agriculture to science and financial services, to incorporate Western legal attributes in order to sustain that development. Developments in the Shenzhen Special Economic Zone suggests that the region's eventual legal infrastructure will blend Chinese and Western components. The multi-trillion-dollar joint Shenzhen-Hong Kong financial services area known as Qianhai is perhaps the best example of China's intention in this regard. Qianhai is touted as China's answer to Wall Street. The Shenzhen and Hong Kong stock exchanges have linked in anticipation of this. More than 70,000 businesses have established offices in Qianhai since its inception. An average of 200 more businesses open offices there every day. An example of the legal experimentation that is underway in Qianhai is the new judiciary. Qianhai courts include both Shenzhen and Hong Kong judges and jurors, which is a huge step for China. Another example is Shenzhen's new Legal Services Development Center, which is charged with identifying foreign laws that might be instructive for the future legal framework of Qianhai and the Pearl River Delta. Shenzhen's International Arbitration Commission has anticipated a blended legal regime by adopting rules that are especially accommodating of international differences and interests. The Commission recently unveiled a set of rules intended specifically for disputes involving parties from countries along China's One Belt, One Road initiative, which focuses on economic concentration or connections between China and South and Central Asia, Russia, and Eastern Europe. With regard to lawyers and legal services, Guangdong Province, in which Shenzhen and the Pearl River Delta are located, has received special dispensation from the national government to permit mainland and Hong Kong law firms and lawyers to form partnerships that are not permitted elsewhere in China. The Hong Kong Law Society recently concluded a study pertaining to the role of Hong Kong solicitors in the development of the legal profession in Qianhai and the Pearl River Delta. Different forms of affiliation between China and foreign law firms are occurring now throughout China. These include the recent Swiss Verein mergers of Dentons and Dacheng, King & Wood and Mallisons, Baker & McKenzie and Fen Shun Partners, Hogan Lovells and Fujian Fidelity, and many others, and many more than are mentioned in this slide. These affiliations, more than anything else, clearly suggest that the world's leading multinational law firms are positioning themselves to take advantage of China's growing global influence by adding China law expertise to their law firms. Peking University's School of Transnational Law was established in anticipation of these developments. STL is the only law school in China and the only law school in the world to offer a common law Juris Doctor degree taught in English alongside a China law Juris Master degree taught largely in Chinese but increasingly with important courses offered in English. Our goal is to create value from the blending and combination of these two curriculums that exceeds the value of studying either independently of the other. Both curriculums are fully accessible by STL's international LLM students. This is a photo of our campus in Shenzhen. This is a photo that includes STL's new building in red in the lower left. It also wishes you all a happy Lunar New Year, which was last weekend in China. We've been very fortunate at STL to establish an outstanding multinational faculty of scholars from the US, China, the UK, and the EU, much like Jindal Global, whose previous and concurrent appointments include faculty such as Harvard, Yale, Stanford, Chicago, London, Aix-Marseille, Hong Kong, and many other leading universities. One of our students recently remarked that studying at STL is like studying abroad in China. The fundamental mission of STL is to first educate students about different legal traditions, and hopefully thereby to promote their ability to contend with the new practices we believe are likely to emerge from the deeper East-West economic integration occurring in Shenzhen and Hong Kong. Second, to contribute to a Chinese legal profession equipped to serve China's increasingly sophisticated economy, and also to compete successfully on an international scale with currently dominant American and British law firms. And third, to provide domestically, in an affordable way, the graduate level legal education top Chinese students traditionally only were able to obtain abroad at great expense. The third mission holds true for LLM students as well. STL's tuition for foreign law students is significantly below half of what they would expect to pay at leading American law schools, and our cost of living is a tiny fraction of the cost of living at most American universities. In 2007, China's State Council authorized Peking University to offer China's first common law Juris Doctor curriculum. The following year, the university's new School of Transnational Law admitted its first students. The university appointed Jeffrey Lehman, a former president of Cornell University and dean of University of Michigan Law School and advisor to Jindal Global Law School, as its founding dean. I succeeded Jeff in 2013 when he went to establish the New York University campus in Shanghai. A defining characteristic of STL is our method of instruction. Serious study of actual cases, followed by deeply interactive class sessions in which professors question students repeatedly day after day? What if the facts changed of the case changed in this way or that way? What if the law changed in this way or that way? Would the result be different or the same? Why or why not? And it is throughout the class period that this occurs. This method is not easy, as you all probably realize, and our students are not always comfortable when professors challenge their reasoning and continually press them for new and different answers. But the outcome of studying law in the context of actual cases, while being exposed daily to a Socratic dialogue, has been clear, because we believe STL students, like those of Jindal Law School, emerge from the process with highly developed critical thinking and analytical skills, with the ability to solve complex problems creatively, and with superior advocacy skills. Although familiar to legal education elsewhere in the world, the case study method and deeply interactive class sessions are a major innovation in China, where classroom instruction typically involves one-way lecturing to large numbers of students, often hundreds at a time. In China law schools, of course, this is partly explained by the fact that Chinese legislation is based more often than not on German civil code. And German civil codes are applied and interpreted according to a highly prescribed step-by-step methodology, rarely influenced by the political, economic, and social policy considerations that typically are the subject of Socratic inquiry. But it is also true that much Chinese legislation reflects the influence of multiple different nations and legal traditions, and that many areas of China law are only partially codified. At STL, we believe this calls for a classroom approach that combines, in the context of case study, instruction in the rigorous step-by-step methodology of statutory interpretation that is characteristic of civil law systems, with intensive interactive classroom sessions and Socratic questioning designed to expose ambiguities and omissions in statutory language, elicit alternative interpretations, and identify possible economic, social, and policy bases of various interpretations. Here's a typical student reaction, Chinese student reaction to STL's method of instruction after having been largely educated through university in a very different way. We believe that STL's program of legal education equips graduates with the skills necessary to contend with and influence the rapidly changing legal environment in Shenzhen and the Pearl River Delta, and soon the changing legal environment throughout China and the rest of the world as China's influence grows. STL is still young. We've only had 5 graduating classes to date, but it appears that many of the world's leading law firms, companies, government offices, and universities agree with this assessment. Postgraduate placement of each of our 5 graduating classes has been just about 100% at the time of graduation, which is a very nice record. They hold positions with leading Chinese law firms and multinational law firms, NGOs, government offices worldwide. STL students pursuing academic careers have gone on for advanced degrees at Harvard, Yale, Oxford, Sciences Po, College of Europe, and other very fine institutions. In a very real way, STL is founded on the assumption that traditional worldwide dominance of the Western legal tradition and Western law firms is destined to be displaced, or at least profoundly affected, by China's emergence as a global economic power. Of course, it is undeniable that cross-border legal services today remain largely the province of US, UK, and a few other Western nation law firms, which have expanded globally to fill the gap in emerging nations between accelerated growth on the one hand and the development of local legal services on the other. To illustrate, the United States has a population of about 300 million people, but over 1.3 million lawyers. In contrast, China has a population of 1.3 billion, but there are fewer than 300,000 Chinese lawyers.
And we have the same lawyers in India.
Yes.
1.3 million.
Yeah. And even though this China number is twice as many as in 2008, 12 times as many as in 1986, and over 1,000 times as many as in 1979. You look at Indonesia, same kind of ratio. The same ratios are characteristic of lawyer populations throughout most of South and Southeast Asian nations, most African nations, and many South American nations. At the same time, as I mentioned, the demand for sophisticated legal services is growing in these markets, and Western law firms and lawyers have moved aggressively to supply the demand. The dominance of Western legal services in emerging markets has been facilitated by the fact that most non-Western nations adopted the laws and codes of Western nations as they were colonialized or as they have modernized. Germany's civil code is evident throughout the civil and commercial codes of China, Japan, Korea, and Taiwan, Dutch in Indonesia, South Africa, Sri Lanka, English common law, India, Singapore, Bahrain, Kenya, and the codes of France, Belgium, and Portugal are evident throughout the rest of the non-Western world. And it is these two facts, the worldwide spread of Western law and the worldwide spread of Western lawyers, that have led most observers to assume that a global harmonization or convergence of law around the Western legal tradition is well underway and is inevitable. But there are compelling countervailing trends as well, all of which I think suggest an emerging global receptivity to China's growing influence. And I don't even include here President Trump in the United States. For example, most of the non-Western nations depicted in this slide have mixed legal traditions, in fact, despite the adoption of continental or common law codes as their official law. Strong customary and religious traditions in these nations remain very highly influential. As Professor William Shaw has noted, work is only now beginning on how the study of traditional legal systems met and often persisted under the westernizing reforms of colonial and imperial influences. Moreover, a good portion of the growth in international commerce today is exclusively non-Western. Consider the burgeoning economic growth between China and Africa, which has grown from $10 million US barely 20 years ago to over $200 billion US today, with a remarkable growth rate of over 700% in the first decade of the 2000s alone. The world likely will witness similar economic exchange and growth along China's One Belt, One Road initiative, which also is largely within nations outside of the Western legal tradition. The tremendous growth and effectiveness of worldwide non-Western diasporas also cast doubt on the convergence thesis. The Economist reported recently that more Chinese live outside of China than French live in France. There are 22 million ethnic Indians scattered across every continent on the globe. Smaller diasporas tie West Africa to Lebanon, and Brazil and Peru to Japan. The world has 40% more first-generation migrants today than in 1990. If migrants were a nation, they would be the world's 5th largest. Commercial ties within these diasporan communities are definitely a growing means of cross-border business. The communities operate largely according to non-Western relational principles, not according to the formalistic Western legal mechanisms that have proved so helpful in fostering economic exchange between parties of different nationalities within the Western legal tradition. The continuing relevance of non-Western practices and preferences in cross-border dispute resolution is reflected in a 2010 study by Hong Kong University professor Shala Ali. She surveyed parties, lawyers, and arbitrators involved in international arbitrations in the principal arbitral institutions in North America, Europe, and Asia. The results revealed very distinct preferences among Western commercial parties for dispute resolution mechanisms that are transparent, highly procedural and adversarial, and that yield strictly legal outcomes according to Western notions of contract law. The results revealed preferences among Asian parties for mechanisms that are far more flexible procedurally, far less adversarial, far more protective of confidentiality, and that yield outcomes that focus on future relations rather than on past facts, breaches, and blame. Finally, the dramatic growth of the legal profession in several non-Western nations also undercuts assumptions about the worldwide harmonization of law around Western legal principles. Leading Chinese law firms, for example, are increasingly displacing long-dominant US and UK firms, not only with respect to international transactions within China, but in international transactions elsewhere in the world. This slide shows comments by a few Western lawyers about the growing competition they are encountering from China law firms. Given the variety of trends I've mentioned, we at STL think it is appropriate for legal education to question the eventual global convergence of commercial law and practices around the Western legal tradition, and to consider the impact of non-Western perspectives as China's global economic influence grows. As Martin Jacques predicts in his epic study, When China Rules the World, with the rise of China, Western universalism will cease to be universal, and its values and outlook will become steadily less influential. The West will be obliged to learn from and incorporate some of China's insights and features. A global Western-style rule of law is by no means proven. The economic internationalization and integration of Shenzhen and Hong Kong are challenging the Western convergence theories more sharply than ever before. Global trends suggest a similar displacement, or at least a convergence of a fundamentally different sort. And this is the future, and the future is China and India. Legal education, I think, must anticipate and keep pace with these evolving shifts in dominant traditions, just as the legal profession seems to be doing already. This is what we were trying to do at STL. I know this is what you are trying to do at Jindal Global Law School. I think our two schools are on the cutting edge of where legal education should be and are a model for legal education worldwide. And I'm very pleased to be here today and see the remarkable progress of Jindal Global over the last 7-8 years. It is truly astonishing. It is humbling. I wish we could have grown as much and succeeded as well. But it is you are part of a remarkable process that is a model for the rest of the world, and we're pleased to share your aspirations and have good relationships with Jindal Global. So thank you very much.
Yeah, please.
Well, thank you so much for this. It's very enlightening, very well put. And I cannot help but, as many of us in this room, I know, compare what you were saying to the Indian experience. And, you know, we were sharing glances, the Vice Chancellor and I, the contrast between what you're describing happening in China and what's happening or not happening in India is very stark. And this is a bit of a, ironically, you might say, that with this very strong legal tradition, which we imbibe here, based on the rule of law and so forth, we must nonetheless seem here to be very far behind in this trajectory. And so we can learn a lot from what you said. Frankly, I thought that what would save us from the domination of China would be the entertainment business. as I say, interest in Hollywood and things like that, so-called Western culture, as China became more universal in those respects. But now I feel maybe even saved by the rule of law, the expansion of lawyers. And I look back on the time when the Soviet Union was breaking up, and again we had the same kind of stunted growth of lawyers. There were no lawyers in Russia. It's a very similar pattern. But anyway, the question I ask you, how immutable is this change? And we look at the United States as an example. You did mention one sentence about that. It seems that anything can change. The United States can change like it changed a couple of months ago. Is there a chance that what we know casually about China, that China can just one day, the governing powers, just pull the plug and go back to 20 years ago?
I can tell you, well, two things. One, I hope the United States has not changed overnight. Our president certainly changed overnight, but I think that we may see a revived Congress and population slow things down. We can only hope. Most of my colleagues at Peking University who are Chinese nationals believe that the process is inexorably moving toward rule of law and will continue to move toward rule of law. It may take a long while. There may be valleys as well as peaks, but they do have confidence that there has just been too much popular acceptance, popular desire for that transition for it not to occur at some point. Of course, in the last year, the signals from the government have been almost the opposite of that. Under Xi Jinping's leadership, there's been a revival of Communist Party supremacy and orthodoxy, a revival of the focus on Mao and his achievements and the problems. So, I don't know. I don't know the answer. I think that it clearly is an economic success. Now, whether they can continue to divide, I don't know how China can continue without internet access. You go to Russia and you have far more internet access than you do in China. And it's basically free access, and in China it's not. There's a firewall which requires a virtual private network, a VPN, to get beyond and access sites outside of China or certain sites in China. Last week, the government announced a new initiative to regulate VPNs more than they have in the past. We'll see if it affects private persons or not, but it is, I can tell you at STL and at Peking University, I've never noticed interference in what we do. There are frustrations bureaucratically in terms of the time it takes to do something, the time it takes to research as opposed to research out, in Europe or the United States. But in terms of academic freedom, we have not been affected. And I hope it's not yet. I just hope we have, that will be the story. So, the jury's out.
Thank you, Philip, for that really inspiring set of reflections, but also a very thought-provoking lecture. I know there may be other questions, but one of the things which I wanted to ask you is that, so there is a fundamental difficulty and dilemma that law professors, I believe, are facing, both, let's say, in India and China. And I'll just briefly articulate that dilemma, which is the fact that how do you instill and in many ways uphold the faith in the rule of law, particularly among law students, in a society in which rule of law is constantly challenged, violated, and at times significantly undermined. So, just 2.5 years ago, we had a major general elections. Over 500 million people voted. It's a classic, true celebration of democracy in this country. And that's the one important narrative. And then you have a situation where these elected members of parliament, there was a study connected with the Association of Democratic Reforms in India, over 40% of these parliamentarians have serious criminal cases pending against them. We are talking about serious criminal cases, including murder and kidnapping and all kinds of possibilities. So, and then we see day in and day out people violating law and getting away with it as well. So how do you, and I say this dilemma in India, and then we transport ourselves to Shenzhen, and we are at the Peking School of Transnational Law, and to what extent legal culture that prevails in a society ought to and actually informs the ability of legal educators to imbibe the faith in the rule of law for the students, and to what extent our own pedagogy should shape that thinking within the academia.
Well, it's an excellent question, and it's one I have as well. I mean, there's no easy answer to that. China has, on the one hand, tried to remove what in India seems to be a fundamental obstacle to pervasive rule of law acceptance, and that is to attack corruption in all respects. I do believe it is more than just the current leadership in China solidifying their power that is the objective of the anti-corruption campaign there. They really do seem intent on eliminating pervasive corruption in the public sector. And China is so large, it takes some time, but you really see fundamentally different behavior in public officials, in anybody close to government-funded activities, etc., than 5 years ago, because of the anti-corruption campaign and because of the seriousness with which it is being undertaken, and because leading people are going to jail rather than enjoying their riches, that they've, their ill-gotten gains. At the same time, there are huge setbacks. There was a Renmin University educated, what was his profession?
Engineer.
He was an engineer who was driving to the airport to pick up his in-laws, arrested by the police, hauled away, locked up, and killed. And this sent shockwaves like no other moment through the rather elite segments of Chinese society that have gone to top universities, that are middle class or better, because they thought, this isn't supposed to happen to us. And it did just a couple weeks ago. And I could even see colleagues shaken by this. And in a human rights dimension, while in India we saw that a billionaire from China with dual nationality with Canada, I think, was taken probably by Chinese secret police from Hong Kong back to China for who knows what purposes. And it is, there are, on the one hand, China is moving to end corruption. On the other, it seems to be moving backwards with respect to fundamental human rights and the ability to invoke the rule of law and judicial process for protecting civil and political rights. So I don't know where it's going to go. I think, you talk to most people in law and development, and they'll, the corruption is what they spend their lives trying to, the problem of corruption is what they try to solve. And how do you do that? And that just, will help. I can tell you, I find our students inspiring with respect to how I see the future. Their appetite for knowledge, for constitutionalism, for rule of law notions is voracious. They are simultaneously intensely loyal Chinese patriots. So they have no desire to disavow China or to walk away from China. They have a desire to, change the way life occurs and to enjoy greater freedoms. And we'll see. That's what causes my more mature colleagues to say it's inevitable that we will achieve this. And the big question is the timeline.
Any questions, comments?
You didn't tell us how many students. in that.
At our law school, we have 450. We'd like to expand. China is very centrally controlled in terms of student quotas, etc. We don't have discretion at the level of a school or even a university to, there's a little bit at the university level to determine the number of students we enroll. Every year we turn away some enormously talented students we would love to admit. And we would have a far superior economic picture if we could increase our student population a little bit as well. But China issues quotas to universities, and its theory of late in terms of, which is very similar to what Vice Chancellor Kumar hopes for India, which is kind of a pervasive elevation of research universities throughout the nation to assist with development. Part of China's efforts to do that now is to theoretically spread the wealth, to keep the quotas at the top schools like PKU and Tsinghua down so that there are more, they spread the students around a little bit, the top students to other universities, and that will help lift the other universities. But it's intensely regulated. We have 450, which is a good size, but I'd like to be larger. And our LLM degree just started a year ago. I think it will become increasingly popular among international students, and it already is reasonably popular, as knowledge of our location grows, of our purpose grows, of the fact we offer so much in English grows, and that our reputation among employers is growing so significantly. And I think it makes sense at so many levels for, I think the next generation of leaders in both countries are going to be those of you with knowledge of both, of the legal systems of both.
Yeah, we have time for further questions. Yeah, Professor Sudarshan.
Thank you very much. I'm reminded of a debate that occurred when India's constitution was being framed as to why should an independent country now take on wholesale the legal system bequeathed to it by the British, because it was a legal system with jurisprudential principles before the British came to India, and then they meddled with those things, changed it, and instituted this system, and there was no serious debate in the Constituent Assembly. It was simply taken for granted. And the Prime Minister at that time remarked when the Constitution had been framed that our Constitution has been purloined by lawyers because of the predominant influence of Western trained lawyers, which was part of the explanation. And so any thought of restoring some indigenous legal principles or legal systems was aborted at that time. And we still haven't had a debate there. My question really is that there were a number of principles. I mean, there was a great scholar of Hindu law who said that the Western legal system is bound to be perverted and abused, and that the only parts of the system that would work are those that resonated with the Dharma Shastra, which is the jurisprudence that prevailed before the British instituted their legal system. So my question is there any, you see, for instance, there was a rule in the Dharma Shastra that if you paid interest that, came up to 20 times the principal, the loan's written off. There's no kind of perpetual compounding of the legal obligation. All of those rules were changed by the British. So I'm wondering if there's any, substantive jurisprudential difficulties between, the Western, say, contract and what, jurisprudence informed by Confucianism or whatever might do. There are in this country, except that this country has adopted the Western system wholesale, and very few people worry now about what are the earlier jurisprudential norms, whereas China, which hasn't adopted this system, we'll say, probably still has a way to develop its own traditions and systems. And so I wondered if there's, how rich or substantive is that jurisprudence?
Well, it's another excellent question, and it's, what you're suggesting is that there is a lot of room for comparative scholarship within a nation, especially a nation that was subjected to colonial rule and the imposition of a different legal system that kind of supplanted the indigenous rules and systems. My own work has looked at it very broadly, only in terms of dispute resolution and preferences, really. And, there's a growing body of literature, especially when rational choice economics was kind of taking hold in universities, that said there were really no cultural differences at all between nations. There were simply kind of systemic opportunities that either were available or were not available. And if there was if there were courts that could be invoked in Japan and China, you would see litigation rates more like the United States or Great Britain. I don't know the answer. I think it's hugely important for study. I do know in my personal experience, which is largely East Asia and Northeast Asia and disputes with Western parties, I have seen and witnessed fundamental differences in approach. Fundamental differences in what a contract means, whether it is evolving, what you do or say in the event someone departs from a contractual term. Is it fluid? Does it look to the future, or do you immediately, impose that as an obligation? And, whether or not those differences would converge if the physical environment of each nation were identical, it's not. So these are things lawyers, I think, need to contend with on a current basis. And I think India presents an enormously interesting intellectual issue of what lies beneath the surface, what remains. Is it? I don't know the answer. I mean, I'd like to hear from all of you about that because it interests me. But it's a great question, and it'll evolve. It's very interesting.
Thank you so much, Philip. We have time for 2 more questions. What we will do is we will take one from a faculty member and then one from students. And we will start with you, Alex. Please go ahead.
Yeah, my question relates to the capacity of the Chinese law schools and lawyers to communicate their knowledge and their experiences in English to a global academic audience or legal audience. So we've already seen this in biology, physics, medicine. There's a tremendous impact of Chinese research on the global world of science. And we've recently seen it also at the Asia Institute in Leiden, which had a conference and book then later on sociology, that there's now so much scholarship coming out of Chinese sociology departments, so much data, so many new concepts, that they have started to talk about the Chinese age in sociological studies. Now I was just wondering, at what point are we going to see it in law, that just the sheer amount of publications and legal knowledge coming out of China is going to become really a major factor?
Well, the one thing I'm noticing about all of you is how superior the questions are, because none of them really have answers that are immediately available. You are correct. I mean, I think right now, what's one thing that's very interesting about China and legal education and lawyers and legal education is how recent it is that there's even been legal education. I mean, there was not a revival until the mid-1980s, and there really wasn't, that didn't even take hold until the mid-1990s. Then there was a massive proliferation of law schools and law programs without much quality control, largely at a LLB type level, and the kind of an overabundance of people choosing law, even though that was the #1 curricular choice of people in China, of students in China for several years running. Now there's kind of pulling back from that. And in terms of scholarship, same thing. Universities are just now, it's a big issue for universities how to promote excellent scholarship. I would say right now there are bureaucratic requirements for promotion, tenure, etc., or their rough equivalents that are numerically based, not really focusing on quality, etc. And it is not likely that will result in a pervasive raising of the level of scholarship in social sciences or law, although there are huge exceptions. The other barrier is language, as you mentioned. I think that the number of Chinese scholars who are top legal scholars who have studied abroad is growing, but we're just really seeing them emerge now as leading voices. And whether they're going to contribute to the worldwide knowledge base of legal developments in China, I think kind of remains to be seen. But we're really, it's in its infancy in compared to some of the science-based initiatives.
Can I just answer? From my own field, I have to say, in the field of international law of the sea, I would say there's probably maybe even 1,000 to 1 ratio of Chinese scholars to Indian scholars. They have a particular interest in law of the sea for reasons that everybody knows. But that's an example. And as you know, one of my colleagues has a daughter at NYU. 1/3 of the students in the LLM program are from China.
Yeah.
Just imagine what that'll be in the
Yeah.
future.
Right.
One last question.
Thank you, Professor, for very enlightening lecture. So my question is somewhat similar to what was asked before me. Now, the question is that if we talk about China's economic emergence and how we should not directly believe in the Western dominance of law and that the Chinese law is also emerging, but the fact remains that the Chinese jurisprudence is not that easily available to the people who are outside China, because and also the question comes about language and how students or how people who are how industries who are working in Western countries will adapt to the Chinese law, or because right now STL is one example where it is and it also started off as giving JD program. So the law that is being taught there is also somewhat Western. So how will you make sure that the Chinese law or the dominance of the Western law breaks without in a scenario where Chinese jurisprudence is not that readily available?
Well, another good question. Number one, I would say that there is not a body of Chinese law that is comparable in definition to the Western legal tradition or to the bodies of law of most Western nations. Not fully developed at all. There are practices, I think, and traditions and customs that I think will probably influence new ways of doing cross-cultural business or international business, but the end product remains to be seen. It won't be a choice of some Chinese, some Western, that kind of thing. It may be a modification of certain Western principles. I think there are analogies within the Western legal tradition. If you look at Dutch good faith and fair dealing, for example, in the body of contract law, you find a much more fluid, socially responsible sort of notion about how parties should adapt or what it means to exercise good faith, or how it can be actionable if you don't do something in good faith, that is fundamentally different from how those provisions might be interpreted in the United States, where they are maybe meaningless or close to, or there is the force majeure doctrine, which says, tough luck if you can't perform because circumstances change. What is it? I can't remember the phrase, but the heavens may fall, but you still have to comply with your contract. And I think that's where we might see some changes. So there might be greater flexibility. We might find that contrary to the Western American tradition of contracts becoming more and more particular in order to make sure a relationship is more stable or more predictable, maybe there'll be, maybe some elasticity is what is essential for stability in cross-cultural, truly cross-cultural relationships, commercial relationships. I don't know, but it is clearly possible. And that kind of counterintuitive notion, I think, is what's so interesting about what these intercultural, international, commercial developments mean. On the scale, we are now seeing them for the first time.
Thank you so much, Philip, for that engaging talk. And to answer you on a lighter note, Vishal, perhaps you should think of going for a second LLM to ST. So,
On a serious note.
on a lighter but on a serious note, it's going to be a very good experience, we all can assure you. All right, so before we end this session, I would request Indra to propose a vote of thanks, but not before honoring your presence over here and acknowledging your visit to our university.
Thank you.
We want to present the official scarf of our university.
Oh,
Your name is officially inscribed on the scarf.
oh, thank you so much.
The colors of all the schools.
And this is India, the elephants.
Thank you.
Okay.
That's an Asian elephant.
Colin, that's your official
Very nice. Thank you.
scarf.